Have you ever found yourself looking back on your childhood and thinking, why were my parents so strict? Maybe you remember curfews that felt unfair, rules that made no sense at the time, or a constant feeling that someone was always watching over your shoulder. For most of my life, I carried that same question with me. I thought my parents were hard, controlling, even a little cold at times. And if I'm honest, for many years I promised myself I would never be like them. But now, at 80 years old, something has shifted inside me. I finally understand why my parents were so strict, and that understanding has brought a kind of peace I didn't expect. I want to share this with you today because I know I'm not alone. Many of us who grew up decades ago were raised in homes where rules were firm, expectations were high, and emotions were not always openly discussed. Back then, it wasn't unusual. But as the years passed and the world changed, it became easy to judge those old ways through a modern lens. Only now, with a lifetime of experiences behind me, do I see the deeper meaning behind those rules. In this conversation, I want to walk with you through that realization, not to excuse every mistake our parents made, but to understand the love and fear that shaped their choices. For a long time, I believed strictness meant lack of affection. When my parents said no, I heard rejection. When they set limits, I felt controlled. I didn't see protection, I saw barriers. As a young person, all I wanted was freedom. Freedom to stay out later, freedom to make my own mistakes, freedom to live life on my own terms. And maybe you felt the same way. It's natural. Youth is full of energy and confidence, and it often believes it knows better. But age has a way of softening that certainty. The first realization came quietly, not in a dramatic moment, but in small reflections over time. I began to notice how many of the lessons my parents enforced through strict rules had stayed with me. Waking up early. Showing up on time. Finishing what I started. Treating others with respect, even when it was uncomfortable. Back then, those rules felt heavy. Now, I see how they shaped my character. They became the foundation that carried me through hard times, even when my parents were no longer there to guide me. As I grew older, I also began to understand the world my parents lived in. They didn't raise us in comfort and abundance the way many families do today. They lived through uncertainty, scarcity, and real fear. Jobs were not guaranteed. Safety nets were thin or non-existent. A single bad decision could change the course of an entire family's life. When I look back with that understanding, their strictness starts to look less like control and more like vigilance. They were not trying to limit my life. They were trying to protect it. One memory stands out clearly now. I wanted to do something that, at the time, seemed harmless. My parents refused, firmly and without much explanation. I was angry for weeks. I felt embarrassed in front of my friends. Years later, I found myself in a similar situation with someone I loved, and suddenly, I felt the same fear my parents must have felt. The fear of something going wrong. The fear of regret. The fear of not being able to undo a mistake. In that moment, I realized that strictness often comes from fear, not of losing control, but of losing someone you love. Another thing I've come to understand is that our parents didn't have the language or tools we have today. They didn't talk about emotions the way we do now. They showed love through responsibility, discipline, and structure. They believed that preparing us for a harsh world was an act of love. And in many ways, they were right. Life is not always gentle. It tests us in ways we don't expect. The discipline they insisted on became armor we didn't know we were wearing until we needed it. As the years passed and I watched my own children grow, I caught myself repeating some of the same phrases I once resented. I set rules. I worried. I lost sleep. And suddenly, my parents' behavior made sense. It's easy to judge strictness when you're on the receiving end. It's much harder when you're the one responsible for another life. Responsibility changes perspective. It humbles you. It teaches you that love is not always soft and pleasant. Sometimes, love is firm and uncomfortable. There's also something important to say about boundaries. My parents' rules taught me that boundaries exist for a reason. Without them, life can become chaotic. Boundaries help us understand where we stand, what's expected of us, and how to navigate relationships. Even though I pushed against those boundaries when I was young, they quietly taught me self-control. And self-control, I've learned, is one of the most valuable skills a person can have, especially as life becomes more complex. Now, at this stage of life, I no longer see my parents as just authority figures from my past. I see them as human beings who did the best they could with what they had. They made mistakes, yes. But they also made sacrifices I didn't understand until much later. Their strictness wasn't perfect, but it was rooted in care, concern, and a deep desire to see their children survive and thrive in a difficult world. This understanding didn't erase the hurt feelings from the past, but it softened them. It allowed me to let go of old resentments and replace them with compassion. And that compassion has changed the way I look at my own life, my relationships, and even the choices I made along the way. As this reflection deepened, it opened my eyes to another layer of truth, one that goes beyond rules and discipline. It's about how strictness shaped our resilience, our sense of responsibility, and our ability to stand on our own feet when life didn't go as planned. That realization leads naturally into the next part of this journey, where the meaning behind those hard lessons becomes even clearer. And feel that these insights are meaningful. Please type number 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I warmly invite you to do so, and don't forget to turn on the bell, so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos designed to uplift, inform, and inspire. Your support truly means a lot. It's what keeps us going and allows us to continue sharing thoughtful, helpful content just for you. Now, let's continue this journey together. As I grew older, especially after my own children were grown and living their own lives, memories from my childhood started to return in a different way. Moments that once felt unfair or harsh began to look different through older eyes. The strict rules, the early bedtimes, the firm no when I wanted a yes, they started to make a strange kind of sense. Not all at once, but slowly, like a picture coming into focus. One thing I began to understand was how much fear lived behind my parents' strictness. Back then, I thought they just wanted control. I thought they enjoyed saying no. But now, at 80, I can see how much responsibility they carried on their shoulders. They were raising children in a world that didn't feel safe to them. Money was tight. Healthcare wasn't what it is now. One mistake, one wrong turn, could change a life forever. Their rules were often their way of saying, "I'm scared something bad will happen to you, and I don't know how else to protect you." I remember being told to come straight home after school. No stopping, no wandering. At the time, it felt suffocating. All my friends seemed to have more freedom. But looking back, I realized my parents were exhausted from worry all day long. Knowing where I was gave them peace of mind. They didn't have phones to check in. They didn't have instant updates. Their strictness was their safety net. Another thing that became clearer with age was how discipline gave structure to our lives, even when we resisted it. We didn't always like the rules, but they taught us habits that quietly carried us through adulthood. Waking up on time. Finishing what we started. Respecting commitments. These weren't just chores or commands. They were lessons in responsibility, even if they didn't feel like lessons at the time. As a child, I saw rules as obstacles. As an adult, I began to see them as boundaries that kept life from spinning out of control. And now, in my later years, I understand that boundaries can actually be a form of love. Not the soft, comforting kind, but the steady, protective kind that holds things together when emotions run high. I also came to understand that my parents didn't have the luxury of gentle parenting the way people talk about today. They didn't grow up discussing feelings or validating emotions. Many of them were raised in even stricter homes, where survival mattered more than self-expression. They parented the only way they knew how. And while they may not have always said "I love you," they showed it through consistency, sacrifice, and showing up day after day. There were moments when their strictness hurt. I won't deny that. There were words spoken too sharply, punishments that felt unfair, and times when I wished they had listened more. But as the years passed, I started to see the full picture. They were human, tired, learning as they went, doing their best with what they had. When I became a parent myself, that understanding deepened. Suddenly, I was the one worrying late at night. I was the one trying to balance kindness with discipline, freedom with safety. And there were days when I heard my parents' voices coming out of my own mouth. Not because I wanted to repeat their mistakes, but because I finally understood the weight of responsibility they carried. That's when a quiet respect began to grow. Not blind admiration, but a mature appreciation. I stopped judging them by the standards of today and started seeing them through the lens of their time, their struggles, and their fears. That shift changed something inside me. Old resentment softened. Memories felt less sharp. I could look back without the same tightness in my chest. Another realization came when I noticed how many people my age carry unresolved anger toward their parents. Anger that has nowhere to go because those parents are often gone. Holding onto that anger only weighs us down. Understanding doesn't erase the past, but it can loosen its grip. It can give us permission to breathe easier. I began talking to my siblings differently too. We shared stories, laughed at things that once upset us, and saw how differently each of us experienced the same household. That taught me another lesson. Strictness isn't one size fits all. What felt harsh to one child might have felt grounding to another. Perspective matters, and it often changes with time. What surprised me most was how this understanding affected my present life. When I stopped viewing my parents as villains in old stories and started seeing them as imperfect people doing their best, I felt lighter. It was as if I had been carrying a heavy box for decades without realizing it, and suddenly set it down. This didn't mean excusing everything or pretending nothing hurt. It meant choosing peace over blame. It meant accepting that love doesn't always arrive in the form we wish it would. Sometimes it arrives as rules, limits, and hard choices made quietly, without explanation. As I continued reflecting, I noticed how these lessons shaped how I treat myself now. I'm less harsh with my own mistakes. I understand that doing your best doesn't always look perfect. I can forgive myself more easily because I learned to forgive them. And as these thoughts settled in, another truth gently emerged. Understanding my parents wasn't just about the past. It was about how I want to live now, in the years I have left. It was about letting go of old stories that no longer serve me and making space for gratitude, peace, and acceptance. That realization brought a calm I didn't expect, and it continues to shape how I see family, aging, and love itself. As I reached my later years, something softened inside me. The sharp edges of old resentments dulled, and the rigid judgments I once held began to loosen. That's when the understanding finally settled in, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet truth I could no longer ignore. My parents weren't strict because they wanted control. They were strict because they were afraid. Afraid of the world hurting us, afraid of us making mistakes that couldn't be undone, afraid of failing in the one job they believed mattered most, keeping their children safe. When I was young, I only saw the rules. The curfews that felt unfair, the expectations that felt heavy, the constant reminders to be careful, to work hard, to behave properly. Back then, it felt like they didn't trust me. It felt like they didn't understand who I was or what I wanted. I pushed back in small ways, sometimes in big ways, certain that freedom meant doing things differently than they did. It took a lifetime to see that their strictness wasn't about limiting my joy. It was about trying to protect it. As I grew older and faced my own challenges, that understanding deepened. Life has a way of teaching lessons slowly. Bills to pay, responsibilities to carry, people to care for, and mistakes that leave marks. I began to see how fragile life really is, how quickly things can change, how one decision can ripple through years. Suddenly, their warnings didn't sound so unreasonable. Their insistence on discipline didn't seem so harsh. It sounded like experience speaking, even if it came out clumsy or firm. One memory came back to me often. My father insisting I be home before dark, no exceptions. At the time, I thought he was just being controlling. Now I imagine him sitting quietly, listening for the sound of the door, heart easing only when he knew I was safe. That kind of love doesn't always show itself with hugs and gentle words. Sometimes it shows up as rules, as limits, as repeated reminders that feel annoying when you're young and precious when you're old enough to understand. I also realized how much responsibility my parents carried silently. They didn't have the luxury of explaining every fear or worry. They were busy surviving, working, holding families together in times that were often uncertain. Being strict was their way of creating order in a world that didn't always offer much of it. Structure was safety. Routine was security. And discipline was a shield, not a punishment. With age came forgiveness, not because they were perfect, but because they were human. They did the best they could with what they knew. I stopped wishing they had been different and started appreciating what they gave me. Values that stayed with me. Resilience that carried me through hard times. A sense of responsibility that helped me stand on my own when life demanded it. This understanding changed how I see my own past choices too. I no longer carry anger for the arguments we had or the distance I felt at times. I see it now as part of growing up, part of becoming myself. And I see their strictness as one thread in the fabric of who I became. Not the whole story, but an important part of it. If you're watching this and thinking about your own parents, maybe feeling a mix of gratitude and regret, know that you're not alone. Many of us only gain clarity when time has slowed us down enough to reflect. It's never too late to make peace with the past, even if the people involved are no longer here. Understanding can still happen. Healing can still happen. Sometimes, I talk to my parents in my thoughts. I thank them for caring so deeply, even when it didn't look like care to my younger eyes. I tell them I understand now. And in that quiet moment, there's a sense of calm, like something unfinished has finally been gently laid to rest. Aging has given me many gifts, but this perspective might be one of the greatest. The ability to look back without bitterness. To see love where I once saw restriction. To recognize that strictness, in its own imperfect way, was an expression of devotion. If this reflection resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did your view of your parents change as you got older? Are there things you understand now that you didn't before? Share in the comments. Your story might help someone else find clarity too. If you found comfort or insight here, please like the video and consider subscribing. These conversations matter, especially at this stage of life, when reflection brings meaning and peace. Thank you for spending this time with me. Remember, wisdom doesn't always arrive early, but it always arrives right on time. Here's to understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet grace that comes with age.